Global Conservation Corps presents the Rhino Man podcast. I'm John Jerko, your host, and one of the directors of Rhino Man the movie. This podcast series is a way for me to interview top conservationists on the topics of rhinos, the poaching crisis, the importance of rangers, and community engagement, all as a way to create awareness around these issues and to promote the coming release of our documentary film. In this episode, I'm talking with Nick Ahlers. Over the last 20 years, Nick has managed a wide variety of sustainable development projects across Southern Africa. He joined Traffic nearly 10 years ago and has held many positions there, along with his most recent promotion to Director of Development. Traffic's mission is to ensure that the trade in wild plants and animals is not a threat to the conservation of nature. Its evidence-based approaches provide guidance and tailored technical expertise to a range of stakeholders across governments, specialized law enforcement, donors, policymakers, private sector companies, academia, and beyond. Nick is based in South Africa and holds degrees in international development studies, environmental studies, African studies with a focus on medical anthropology, and a master's in science in environment and development from the London School of Economics. In this conversation, we dig into Nick's early curiosity and passion for the environment, his path into conservation, which took him from Maine to South Africa, and how his career brought him to Traffic. We dive into Traffic as an organization and the work being done there. We go deep into the rhino horn trade and talk through the ramifications of potentially legalizing it. We also talk about findings from prisoner interviews in relation to illegal wildlife trade. Nick has a wonderful ability to turn data and research into understandable concepts, and I'm excited to share this episode with you. So without further ado, here's my conversation with Nick. All right, Nick, welcome to the Rhino Man podcast. It's an honor to have you on here. Thank you for joining.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, so why don't you give us a little bit of your current role? You just made a change recently. What's that mean? What were you doing before, and what are you doing now, and where are you working?
Right. Thanks for having me again. I'm Nick Ahlers, and I work for Traffic. We're wildlife trade specialists, and I just recently, as of a couple of weeks ago, or even last week, I changed into a new role based in South Africa. Been with Traffic for about 10 years, and I've had a couple different roles since then. But most recently, I work as the Director of Development, which is a global role that focuses on our strategic partnerships and fundraising. And prior to that was, for the last 2.5 years, I was the Africa Program Director, so covering all of our work across our various program offices and across the continent. We've got an office in Cameroon covering the Congo Basin, Tanzania covering East Africa and the Horn, and Southern Pretoria and Cape Town covering the SADC region, basically, with some projects in West Africa as well. Before that, for about 7 or 8 years, was leading one of our larger global projects that had a focus on Africa to Asia trade flows. So worked quite a lot on the issue of rhino poaching, just kind of at the peak of the poaching crisis, and when it first kind of started to really kick into, becoming a big global issue back in around 2013 or so.
Yeah, and I think we'll definitely dive into some of that rhino poaching as well, since that's a big part of what we're covering with this podcast. But give me a little bit more idea. What's your day-to-day in the new role? I'm kind of curious.
So Traffic, in the last year or so, we've just wrapped on our previous program strategy, our program that we've been spending the last year basically developing what our new strategy is going to look like to 2030. And very much taking an internal, stock taking of what has been going well, what are the areas that we want to continue to focus on, a lot of external consultation just from partners and other groups that we work with to help shape, what the vision is, looking at the horizon line and seeing, from a predictive measure, what are the issues that we need to be aligned with, and taking with that the different approaches that we'll be deploying to be able to have the impact that we want to achieve. And so that part of that is really, we work very much in our kind of cornerstone is the partnerships that we work with. Traffic as an organization, it's an evidence-based organization that, through just by that definition, have a wide-ranging list of partners that utilize the information that we gather to help them either with efforts either from a law enforcement perspective or a regulatory perspective, or even private sector engagement, we take a supply chain approach. So from the point of harvesting all the way to the consumer, from a trade perspective, you can imagine every stakeholder along that supply chain. At some point, we have quite a range of partnerships that work to utilize the evidence base to ensure that the trade is as legal and sustainable. Ultimately, our mission is driven by a world where trade doesn't compromise the species' survival in the wild. So, as you can imagine, working very hand in hand with international policy fora like CITES and the Convention of Biological Diversity and others that provide the kind of backbone or framework for which the regulatory work is defined. And then within that, all of the other peripheral sector work that either we're working to remove illicit proceeds or trade from supply chains or encourage legal and sustainable trade. So depending on the commodity, we very much assess that in terms of its ultimate impact on species and their survival.
Yeah, it's really interesting because it's not just pointing out the illegal wildlife trade and helping stop that, but you're actually also helping develop and encourage sustainable wildlife trade, correct?
Exactly.
Yeah. Yeah. So, I mean, there's so many different things that you guys are doing over at Traffic, and I really want to dig into a lot of those. But before we go too far into that, can we kind of start, where are you from originally? How, maybe like we can go through the story of how you got into this space, into conservation, into Cape Town.
Yeah, sure. Yeah. Well, the accent probably gives a hint, but it's kind of muddled over the years. I've been actually living in Southern Africa for most of my life, about 25 years. And that includes, South Africa as largely the home base during that time, but with stints in Mozambique for 5 years or so, in Zimbabwe as well as other outposted roles. Originally from Maine in the U.S., where I grew up as a kid, but actually moved on my own to South Africa when I was a late teenager, finished school and left for an adventure, which has led me down many different paths, but I basically was always passionate about conservation, the environment. That was very much so much just inherent in how you grow up as a kid in Maine, I feel like. But that combined with just what I was exposed to at that young age coming here and just seeing how amazing the diversity was and biodiversity in the landscapes, it was just, I was hooked.
Before you go too far, do you have any memories growing up in Maine that connect with what led you down this path? Anything that kind of stands out?
I would have to say, I mean, I was a kid that was obsessed with nature programs. I was, if I was watching TV, it would be, just absorbing any kind of nature.
Marty Stauffer's Wild America. Did you ever get into
exactly
back in the day?
Yeah, and even the voice of David Attenborough, who I've had the pleasure of meeting too, just my one of the idols, and I had a poster, of maybe. People had posters of pinup models or whatever. I had Jane Goodall in my bedroom, and I was an early. We spent a lot of time outdoors. We just were always hiking and camping and fishing and all that stuff. So as a kid, it just was a natural extension of what my interests were. But I was always more, less on the straight up ecology, biology, and more of the human development, sustainable development interests. That was, from a society perspective, that I always had perked my interest much more, which I ended up doing a bunch of different degrees, but were related to both environmental sciences, so getting that foundation, but also development, so international development and environmental sciences, and then did a bit of a detour at UCT. I studied more anthropology and medical anthropology, looking at humans' relationship to their health and all the different systems that exist, and found that really fascinating. And at the time, didn't realize how much that would help in just getting a really unique perspective on the way, the world works and what are the motivators and drivers of people's relationship to their environment. And, I did another degree in the UK along the way in London, looking at more trade, climate change, trade economics, and environment and development from that perspective. So all the different hats that I've worn and careers before Traffic have kind of led me to piece together, these different experiences that ultimately serve me in the role that we have with Traffic, because that's really what we're talking about most of the time. Is where trade exists, it's obviously as a product of humans' interaction with their environment, the utilization of resources for their either survival or for their basic economy, or it's so linked that I've always had that kind of big picture motivation.
Yeah, super interesting. And what made you go to South Africa in particular when you were that young? I mean, it's a pretty big leap to take at that age.
Yeah. Yeah, I got lucky. I got a job as like a teacher's assistant working at a school in Johannesburg, which I was largely teaching biology to grade school level students. And through that was also, the school went on a lot of different trips, and I had the dirty jobs too of being, boarding house duty and disciplining kids that were, you know, misbehaving at bedtime and all that stuff too, which it was fun for the time that it was. But that really just was a time for also for me to take a bit of a pause. I was a kid that was really involved in everything. I was interested in everything. I did well in school. I just had so many different interests that the thought of trying to narrow that down into a degree that would actually get me anywhere, I needed to take some time to figure out what it is exactly that I wanted. And that year just exposed me to so many things that just reaffirmed that I was on the right track. And by the time I did a first degree in Canada in Halifax at Dalhousie University, and by that time I was really keen to see how I could piece together all of my real life interests into a degree that would basically get me back to here, back to this part of the world. But working on issues that I found myself really caring about, and actually is basically what I'm doing now. So it was a multi-decade journey.
Yeah. I mean, do you think that is a big part of what drove you, was finding some kind of purpose in this kind of these bigger issues and trying to find ways to find solutions?
Yeah, I've always, I guess you could call it like, I don't know, I've always been a glutton for punishment and taking on things that are just really by nature. I mean, we always joke in traffic that we must be, there's something wrong with us, that what can be quite depressing work. I mean, statistically, you're up against a really uphill battle with some of these really complex issues. But if you start to break it down and you start to really work through what are those enabling conditions, or what are those really foundational issues that really need to be addressed. I mean, the mix of expertise that we have in the network and who you actually are able to engage as a result is just endlessly interesting. I mean, and in addition to knowing that you're doing your best to resolve some really complicated problems, you're also exposed to so many different types of experts that equally need the information that you can provide as much as you are providing an expertise back. So there's a real mutually beneficial, I guess, side effect that comes with the type of work that we do, that it's probably a symptom of why so many people who start with traffic are still with traffic. It's not unusual to see colleagues that have been around. I've been 10 years and I often feel like I'm a newbie. But it's because the work is ever evolving, but it also requires us to constantly learn, and it scratches that itch, I suppose.
Yeah, it sounds like you're definitely the type of person that is constantly reading and learning and exploring, and curious mind for sure.
Bit of a nerd like that. We're all a bunch of geeks.
I love it. Yeah, I'm quite a nerd at heart as well, so I respect that. Yeah, so I feel like that's a good jumping off point to some of the different areas we can dive into with what you guys are doing at Traffic. I don't know if you have a specific area you'd like to start, but I know you mentioned financial crimes. Maybe that's a good place. Maybe you can kind of expand on what that means in the context of Traffic and some of the work you've done.
Sure. Yeah. Well, early on when I started working with Traffic, I was really fortunate because the project that I was brought on to lead had, by definition, was quite flexible. There was a bit of seed money that we eventually, just testing and piloting approaches, were able to get a lot more interest and momentum over the years. So what started out as a 3-year project funded by USAID called the Wildlife Traps Project through our IUCN partner in the DC office we got a lot of traction, and that project grew from 3 years to 5 years to 7 years which is still going. I think it's now going to be a total of 12 years at the existing rate. But using what at the time was really needed to bring in, it was by the point of the project was to start working and engaging with, at the time, non-traditional stakeholder groups that had to be more meaningfully brought into the debate or the discussion. And at the time that, it was, the poaching crisis was starting to really escalate. There was a lot of global attention and momentum. And, you had I felt like I was flying around the world to another global symposium or conference on illegal wildlife trade. And so the policy level was really in high gear. The country attention by consequence was really in high gear. And just how you're translating all of those actions, there was just a real uptick in the amount of attention. So kind of riding this wave, I suppose, of momentum that was pretty unprecedented for an environmental cause or issue was allowed us to really get in with or make progress with some of these more tricky industries or sectors. So that included the transportation sector, which I can touch on a bit later. A lot more of our traditional law enforcement work was able to be enhanced by getting more specialized and using different techniques, working with more specialist units and prosecutors and all of that as we were translating and revising national legislation. There's a lot going on. But also, advancing our work on behavior change, social behavior change and demand reduction work really ramped up in this time, and the evidence base to be able to try and test different approaches that were actually showing a difference in how it affected people's consumer behavior patterns, as well as other areas like forensics and trying to assist with our partner Trace, the Wildlife Forensic Network. They do really good work in developing technologies that can be used by countries to answer, really important law enforcement questions. The community angle, as you can imagine, or as you've seen, I'm sure, with so many of the episodes of the podcast, that there's just been, as a consequence of the threat, this real heavy enforcement response to the poaching crisis, and rhinos in particular, and just as a counterpoint to the criminality that has been so devastating in so many ways, but really making a point of saying that within that the communities as front lines of a lot of these issues, we need to be more evidence-based and robust in how we're incorporating that as a key ally and stakeholder in this debate, and developing frameworks with other experts and partners that can really start to untangle these really complex socioeconomic problems into more tangible intervention areas for how we really think about this, and acknowledging that because of all these factors, there's really no one-size-fits-all solution that has to really feed into those direct grievances or conditions. So we can go into that too, but spent quite a bit of time developing these types of theories or more practical tools that field practitioners can use and donors can use when developing projects. Another area was the financial crime space, which I was fortunate to lead on for traffic for many years. And at the beginning, back in 2014 and those times where a lot of the attention was building, viewing illegal wildlife trade as a financial crime was very, in its infancy. And it wasn't so much about people understanding that, it's a for-profit crime, therefore it is a financial crime. There's no way about it. There was just such little actual precedent for using any kind of legislation that would, even just as a predicate offense, to employ or use financial investigation. And that was both from the private sector, the banks themselves acknowledging this as a financial crime, as well as the enforcement agencies. And you had at the same time a lot of countries that had really fledgling financial intelligence units themselves don't have a lot of capacity or staff in these units to really follow the money, as the term says. So this was really important for me because, we see in a lot of the work that happens from an enforcement perspective, really just by consequence focuses at a very low level of enforcement. So you're catching the poachers, you're catching the transporters and maybe the recruiters or suppliers in some cases, but that upper echelon of the trade chain really remains pretty untouched to this day. I mean, it's gotten much better, but the financial crime angle was a way of attempting to really get to that higher level of the trade chain, or at least be able to get to the levels where you're actually trying to seize and remove the physical assets that are facilitating the trade.
Because I imagine a big part of it is, you need some kind of evidence that they're financing or profiting off of this, right? Which is difficult unless you can really have a great way of following that money trail.
Yeah, exactly. So, I mean, early on, I got into the right spheres and partners that were doing a lot of really good work on this. Like UNODC has been doing this for years, but just now incorporating the same tactics that they've done for other financial crimes, using very proactively wildlife as another way of raising awareness and attention. And so this led to, a lot of different training opportunities. We started getting a lot of interest from the banks coming more in an ad hoc way to traffic, saying, give us some information. We've got our internal systems to evaluate, individuals and companies that use our books. And we want to be able to create better algorithms that will help pick up or to detect the suspicious activity. And this started to get so much that it gave me the idea that if we were to have a task force style approach like United for Wildlife had at existing for the transportation sector through the Royal Foundation, that if we were to use the convening power of that mechanism to bring together the banks in a way that would ensure that they are getting the right information, they're getting the same information, and information that was actually answering the questions that they had, that we'd have a much easier time of just managing this beast, but also ensuring that we could use that collective emphasis for good. And at least from that standpoint, get the banks thinking about this and to be able to use their own systems to see what comes out of it. So, we used that project, that same Wildlife Traps project, to provide the seed funding for this expert group that eventually became what is now the United for Wildlife Financial Task Force, that was launched through the Mansion House Declaration at the London conference back in 2018.
Can you talk about some of the challenges? I mean, what are the concerns, or maybe just stumbling blocks of trying to get these banks to work together and convince them that this is worth doing?
Yeah, I think the convincing part wasn't as difficult. I mean, we were quite pleasantly not surprised, but we were pleased to see the amount of response. I mean, it was similar to the transport work. It wasn't so much about the argument or the rationale. I mean, they know the risks from an illicit crime perspective. This was such a high value one. I mean, all the statistics are there, and it was really about, I guess, because environmental crimes or wildlife crimes are just by nature seen as less serious as some of these other ones that they're used to having to deal with, and have a legal obligation to report against, like human trafficking, for example, is another counterpoint to a trade that is, they have a lot of internal industry requirements for ensuring that they are reporting everything that they're finding on anything related to that. So, but using the same kind of logic, what ended up becoming an interesting angle for us is being able to use whatever data that we're collecting on the wildlife crime side with other convergence with other types of organized crime that, not just from a bank perspective, but from a financial intelligence unit perspective, they have so many issues that they're dealing with on a daily basis, and they're under a lot of pressure from their management to, tackle really, specific targets and indicators on particular crimes. That the more we can demonstrate the interconnectivity between wildlife crime and other types of crime, the better able they are to apply the right type of resources and efforts to be able to tackle these. And obviously, the more, if you can tackle two with the same effort, This is all easier said than done, of course, but just being able to demonstrate the interconnectivity with these, there's often, as soon as you start scratching on the underbelly of, the financial underbelly, you really start to see how connected and often overlapping these crimes are. So,
By that, can I interrupt? Just by that, you mean, someone that's selling drugs or maybe arms or even in human trafficking are oftentimes the same people that are dealing in illegal wildlife trade.
in some commodities that it's more prevalent.
Yeah.
You often see a lot of convergence in just the commodities that are converged, but also just the structure of the organization may be dealing with multiple types of illicit trades at the same time. And at the end of the day, it's high reward, low risk, high reward, right? So flavor of the day, if you can really profit off of rhino horn, for example, then you're going to pick it up and pivot to that. Even if temporary, it's very little about the commodity itself.
Just the same criminals looking for the easiest way to make the most money, basically.
Yeah, and you often see, the more you investigate that work, the more you see examples of that. And even just more other types of crimes you can prosecute for. So even if it's more corruption oriented, where bribery, those types of crimes as well. It's just been a really interesting, from a research perspective, to answer some of those questions for these partners. So what really was a game changer was, in addition to the momentum that was created with the banks all working together, I think there's over 45 global financial institutions. All the big ones you can think of are part of the task force, and that's all great. But how does that translate to it actually triggering suspicious activity? That suspicious activity being legally required to send to the financial intelligence unit of each national country for them to do an investigation. The mechanics have to be in place for that flow to happen. So all of this effort of the last few years have really been about getting that flow happening in the way that it should, or the way that the system's designed to. So one of the big things that helped was the Financial Action Task Force made it a priority crime, focus back in, I think it was 2019, with a presidency led by China. And then after that ended, the transition to Germany, where they broadened it to environmental crimes, but still kept it high on the agenda. And that alone really made a big difference, because ultimately countries, when they're evaluating their risks as a country, almost always, or previously, environmental crimes or wildlife crimes were never included as a risk or threat to the country. So there's a real systematic process that gets kicked when these types of things are embedded. So if you don't include wildlife in that risk assessment, you're not going to be evaluated on it as a country when FATF comes to do an evaluation of how you've made progress on the risks that you've identified. And if it's not there, then the resources don't get allocated and you don't get the level of attention. So you often get this dynamic where goodwill, good intentions, you're knocking on the door, this is an important thing, but structurally, it's not something that the accountability aspect to it is missing. So, and it's not to say that, the countries want to be able to include the risks that are most threatening to their economies, to their societies. And, all these things that are known. So it's more about creating the awareness for them to accurately include these, so that it trickles down to, it translates into the resourcing as well as the accountability side of things. So that alone has made a big difference in just putting it on the agenda, but also the research and associate, peripheral things that happen are triggered when a body like FATF prioritizes a crime like that. So it's really, taking it from an industry perspective, really been amazing to see, going from, shouting down a wind tunnel back in 2014 into the ether of saying, like, this is an important thing, to having it be really kind of all the pieces working together. Now the issue is actually having because financial crime is a very difficult and costly thing to have to do. All the training and capacity that goes into the type of investigative work, and really to be able to provide the evidence base that will hold up in a court of law, there's a lot of rigor that is required. So it is a challenge, but for lack of alternative in really getting to those higher levels of the crime types, we're still dealing with probably less than 1% of cases that use these types of investigative techniques. And one of the things that I did was the last few years in partnership with UNODC and various contributions from partners from around the world we really wanted to try as best as we could to compile a case digest, or I guess a bunch of typologies that would answer from a financial data perspective, what are the payment methods, what are the different techniques that people individuals or organizations are using to launder or move proceeds from different places. So that was fascinating because it took a couple of years for us to do, but canvassing the globe as best we could to get cases that had gone through the system or either were still under investigation, but sanitized, just to be able to give us that raw data to start pulling out trends and patterns of how this is actually happening in practice. And that being really helpful to both the banks and the financial intelligence units to start to see, okay, how best can what are the likelihoods of things, different techniques being used, applied to different crimes or associated entities that are involved in the trade. And even just network structure, all of that stuff. And as you can imagine, a lot of it was rhino horn related. And it was just fascinating because then you really start to get into the detail of how the people do it. How are they actually paying for this and moving physical product? It was really fascinating.
In the case of rhino horn, is there a trend, like a way that people are using payment methods the most, or I don't know if there's any detail you can give to that?
Well, that was one of the findings from the report, is there was such a diverse range of different techniques. I think one thing was pretty common is obviously the closer you get to the poaching end of it, the more cash-based the transactions are. And then the more you go into the middle part of the trade chain and then farther, it turns. So the money's going this way, the product's going the opposite direction. And then it goes much more from cash or Western Union or, courier type payments, mobile based payments, to transactions that go through either shell accounts or false accounts, or to the other end where you're getting more sophisticated payment methods. So that alone is helpful to the banks to be able to understand like where the intersection is with the formal financial sector versus more informal ones. And things like Hawala is nearly impossible as a traditional financial mechanism that's been going on for centuries. It's really almost like a barter system where you have very little exchange in cash, but it's based on the value of commodities that are traded and deposited here, taken out there on the other end, and facilitated between two people. So you see, like for the example in abalone in South Africa is another commodity type that there's so many parallels to rhino horn in particular, but what often happens is the syndicates will come with drugs, methamphetamine and tick, and they will actually do a barter exchange for the product one-to-one. So there isn't actually exchange in cash or money, which keeps it cleaner and easier to conceal. And then they'll trade that way. And then any additional drugs that the community side gets can be sold onward and make additional money with. So it very quickly becomes not a conservation issue, as you can imagine.
Wow, super interesting. Can we talk about some more of the similarities? And I know we had a call before where you were talking about, we were kind of going over the argument for and against potentially making rhino horn a legal trade, because unlike ivory, where you have to kill the animal, theoretically you can harvest horns from rhinos. So I don't know if you could talk more about those similarities and why, in your mind, based on the data, it doesn't look like a great idea to open up rhino horn to legal trade.
Yeah, there's a lot of layers here, so we'll try and untangle it. But I mean, just to start out with, I want to say, as we mentioned, Traffic as an organization, as an evidence-based organization, we are pro-trade when the evidence suggests that would be a beneficial tool for the survival of the species. And there's many examples where that is the case. And obviously a legal trade in natural resources and wildlife is a huge part of everyone's daily life in the global economy. Where it gets tricky is when you have it alongside a number of different either socioeconomic or political issues that complicate just the simplistic trade perspective. And we have just abalone is a really good example that parallels rhino in a lot of ways. And obviously there's big differences too, being but a marine species, it has been traditionally used for a long time. But really what we're talking about is the tension between the haves and the have-nots. And that I'll break that down, but it really translates to so many different levels of what we're talking about here, all the way to the consumer end, as much as the drivers and motivations for each level of the supply chain, illicit or legal. And in the case of abalone, there's a lot of parallels with rhino because you're ultimately dealing with a quite easily extractable resource from the wild or from protected areas, but largely driven by history and a lot of grievances. And in South Africa, we have this kind of perfect storm of factors that have led us to, the situations we're in now, in part because of just the way policies have translated to access and ownership issues, to rights-based approaches to benefiting from, equitably from resources, to a lot of grievances with how fisheries policy in the case of abalone has translated to quotas and permits for small-scale fishermen and communities to access. And there's an entitlement there all around for what is perceived to be owed to them, but also what is something that is actually providing their basic means of survival. And you have, by consequence, a large population in these areas that haven't been able to benefit from a formal education system, don't have a lot of alternative economic alternatives, that perceived opportunities that are available to them. And you have a lot of history, and in the abalone case, a lot of connections with organized crime. And this has made abalone as a resource, the target of what is really a much bigger social, societal problem. And there you can see a lot of parallels with rhino. And you have this dynamic where the resource itself, as it's quite near to shore and easier, in quotes, to extract along a massive coastline that's very difficult to enforce, you've got this kind of combination of factors met with a real demand for the product in Asia. So by consequence, you have people providing external pressures to supply a product. You've got the scientific data that's coming into the government to analyze and say, oh, gosh, the resource is being depleted. We have to really be strict about the number of quotas that we issue from illegal trade, just from a responsible governance perspective, feeding into, again, this grievance about being able to have rights to these permits and quotas. And then you have the temptation of these really high value commodities people coming in with cash on the spot or drugs on the spot to a community that is really it's way too tempting. And because of the way it's happened, it becomes quickly a community issue where you have a real imbalance of people who are benefiting, but also able to supply and get other community members involved in different roles along the way. And you have grandmothers renting out freezer space to provide, a space for temporarily freezing abalone before it's processed, or, it infiltrates really quickly. So you are dealing with a problem that quickly becomes easy to point the finger saying, well, who's ultimately responsible? Which government department is responsible for this? This is no longer a conservation issue. This is a security issue. This is a organized crime issue. And then obviously becomes incredibly difficult to make any headway.
Yeah. I mean, just to interrupt for a second, I mean, I think the sort of complexity that going into the rhino poaching situation, I had no idea. And after spending a lot of time there, you're just like, wow, this is not a simple solution. And I mean, especially with basically you're talking about a lot of these racial tensions too from post-apartheid era South Africa. In a lot of ways, I mean, their arguments can definitely feel justified because of some of these grievances you mentioned. But at the same time, we're facing potentially the loss of a species in both of these cases. So It's like, how do you balance all of this? And with all this finger pointing going on, and there is a lot of corruption, even on the government or like community government level. There's all these factors with people coming in with lots of money to entice people. So it just makes it so complex and not easy to understand. And I think it's, you kind of have to be in it for a little while to realize that it's mostly gray. I mean, there's no this is right or this is wrong. There's a lot of nuance to all of this.
Exactly. I mean, we get asked this question a lot. Obviously, the debate of whether to legalize rhino horn, for example, is obviously very complex. I mean, everybody has good intentions with their wanting to back or defend a side and being evidence-based and looking at the supply chain as a complete supply chain. I mean, there are, again, just a lot of parallels with what could happen with something like that, because in the abalone case, you have a legal trade that's very limited based on the quotas, but 95% plus of the abalone that goes to Asia is poached. And it's only after, traffic's been doing this for decades, is kind of retroactively analyzing customs data, because it's not CITES listed anymore. When you trade it, you code it as abalone. So it's quite easy to just see the volumes that come back that are being exported from not just South Africa, but smuggled across the border to neighboring countries and exported from there. But you get the whole picture, and you see very quickly the volumes of product that are coming out of South Africa's waters. So the bottom line is you need to be addressing these foundational issues before you can really promote a legal trade like that in a meaningful way. If it doesn't solve those foundational problems of those grievances or socioeconomic issues, or there has to be a balancing of this. And not only that, but what I think needs to be factored in is the consumer side. And it is very risky to me. I mean, I completely understand, and I've been in so many of these meetings and circles where the private rhino owners, in this case, which, more than half of the rhinos in South Africa, have real legitimate concerns and issues and challenges with footing the bill for the protection of the species that they are very proud to have. This is a symbol of so many different things, and I get it. It's a crazy thing to have to constantly have to fight, and you have this external pressure that is forever there, and really, what's the end game here? I think it's important to look at history. At Traffic, we've had the benefit of being able to see these trends over multiple decades, and we've been around since the 70s, so we've been gathering a lot of this data, and it's easy to focus really on the existing crisis now and the motivations and drivers for that. But this is nothing new. Rhino horn there's been a lot of poaching crises in the past. I mean, in the 60s and 70s, Japan was the economic booming nation in that time period. And there was, as you can correlate on a map almost exactly at the same period when a country reaches a certain growth in GDP with when it starts to become a major consumer of wildlife products, and in turn luxury wildlife products. So Japan was in the 60s and 70s. South Korea was in the 80s. Taiwan was in the late 80s and 90s. And all of them at the same point in their growth period became the leading, rhino horn consumer, in the same way that there was about a 15-year period from around 1993, I believe, where there was a threat from CITES and through U.S. law to sanction countries that were trading illegally in rhino horn. And at the same time, I think it was those countries removed rhino horn from a legal pharmacopoeia for traditional medicine. And it almost overnight dropped to nothing. And there's a couple cases a year of poached rhino for about 15 years. And then in Zimbabwe, it started to pick up again in the early 2000s because of the economic crisis that happened there. It spread to South Africa. But at the same time, you have Vietnam and China and Thailand all at the same time reaching that same economic trajectory, and therefore having a larger middle class that had the buying power to actually have the expendable income to start demanding these types of products. So again, kind of a perfect storm of factors that came around where, when we saw in the current poaching crisis, But the difference between this and previous use types is the motivation for why rhino horn became a consumer item in Vietnam was very different to a traditional medicine approach. I mean, it was very clear that this was a flashy status power symbol for the wealthy business elite to, flex their muscle. So in the same way that it became a quick fad, in every other historical trajectory of consumption, there becomes this collective societal consciousness where the demand drops. I mean, the US was a huge consumer back in the day. The European Union, UK, all of them were never, they followed the exact same trends that we're seeing in other countries. So you can actually use it as a predictive model, knowing this of what are the next countries that we need to be looking at and how can we get in early to really move people away from these behaviors that have such detrimental impacts. But so what we're seeing through our research, and we've done a lot of behavior change work and campaigns in Vietnam through traffic and our Chi campaign that's been going for many years, but really targeting that specific profile. The audience of this campaign is those business elite. And what I think people don't really appreciate is when you have a fad like that, where there's a very wealthy and powerful elite that are consuming it, it sends a message to the rest of society. It's way too expensive for the average person to consume. But you have a very tiny percentage that you're targeting. And if you can influence them, then pretty much this whole thing falls apart from a demand perspective. So there's been a lot of focus on that. And the research now, I mean, it turned a number of years ago, but there is a downward trend in consumption and what people perceive. We've turned that corner, I think, based on just the evidence and surveying that we've been able to do. But the important thing, though, is that what it sends to the rest of the market is if you're going to entertain the idea of legally supplying a product like that, you're not only sending a mixed message to the market, but you're sending a message to the rest of the population that couldn't afford, didn't want to do it, but would do if they could, because they want to achieve that same status. In the same way that poachers want to achieve the status of the other poachers that are driving fancy cars and having, nice watches, and, that's a real motivator. So the danger is, compared to previous decades when this trend was happening, is there's only 20,000 plus 23,000 or so rhinos left. And that is a really risky move, even though the supply is renewable in that sense. The horn grows back, but very complicated to do from a veterinary perspective and risky and all those things aside. Even if you could supply legal, sustained supply, there's a lot of evidence to suggest that without addressing those socioeconomic factors that are foundational to why these issues persist, you will have the same ability for people to take advantage of those loopholes and still take offtake and feed into a legal market in the same way that you see happening with abalone, just because it's just too easy to do and to get away with. So from the demand side, it's really complicated and doesn't make sense from that perspective, in my opinion. But also just from the regulatory approach and the systems that you would need to be able to enforce and ensure that it doesn't get corrupted is a whole other issue. Not to mention, it's internationally illegal unless you have those annotated permits through CITES for different types of trophy hunting and other uses, live animal trade. There isn't a country in the world that would voluntarily sign up to open its market to this product at this time. So while I completely understand that we need to try different things, like the status quo is not working, setting up a legal trade, it's dangerous, but it also, there is so much more evidence to suggest that integrated models where you're meaningfully bringing in those communities as proper beneficiaries to the system seems to me like a much more logical way to have a sustained impact. And then you don't have to answer these questions of, do we want to see a world where you may have some rhino that are wild, but a large majority of them are pretty much domesticated and being euthanized or tranquilized to shave off their horns every now and again, like cattle or something like that. They're different arguments, but just for the vision that we collectively want for the species.
Super interesting, and I feel like a lot of things to pull out of that. And just towards the end, they're talking about the communities and and making them, more stakeholders in these reserves and participants in them. I mean, I think that goes beyond just the rhinos as well. I mean, there's so many of these, going back to the grievances and a lot of these issues in South Africa in particular. I think that's work that needs to be done regardless of the rhino itself. So I think that's super important to address that. And then, when you're talking about, I think this is kind of what you were saying is, if we flood the market all of a sudden with all this new horn that's suddenly legal, then that's going to allow the people that were maybe not as rich as the top couple percent to all of a sudden have access to this product, which then creates this new demand that will kind of take it into overdrive and potentially deplete the rhinos.
Yeah, and you're looking at the populations of these countries in Asia. It's not just the rhino horn, but look at other commodities, products that you would be up against a really difficult, challenging issue if you were to, I don't even know how you could flood the market with the amount of product that's actually supplyable. But that aside, it's just the message that sends is Pandora.
Yeah.
And we have other options that we can, the government of South Africa, they've done an amazing job of trying to get a handle on this, as much as it's been, rife with other challenges and all the, the issues that we know that present real hurdles for them to have to deal with, the corruption angles and just the systems that are required to be able to coordinate all of these efforts is just tremendous. And the cost is tremendous. But, they have a plan in place. I mean, they've been really pushing this angle with creating more equity and benefit sharing around natural resource management in general. But you're up against, too, I mean, a lot of these areas where the poaching is the highest is also the highest growth population rates in the country along the borders of these protected areas. And we have to be pushing these types of things not just for rhinos, as you say, but for so many other issues that are going to be facing the same communities for the foreseeable future until we can really get a handle on creating a more even playing field for everybody. You mentioned the interviews with prisoners. So we did interviews with incarcerated people that had been, convicted for different wildlife offenses, and the vast majority of them rhino poaching related or rhino related crimes, as well as abalone and cycad. And it was really interesting because we got, put all the ethical clearance, and we got approval from the Department of Correctional Services to do these interviews, and started to track them down across the country in these different facilities where they're based. And it was voluntary. They had the option to say no, but almost all of them were more than happy to talk. And just as an approach that was probably, has been underutilized, is they sit there, they've never really been asked, outside of the court process and the investigative process about the deeper drivers and motivations for why they started engaging in these crimes. And while the results weren't necessarily surprising, they confirmed a lot of what we had assumed, confirming assumptions that we had, but also really gave us an insight into the realities of people and just the different demographics and drivers. So as you can imagine, there was a real mix of competing pressures that related to just being able to provide basic, money for their family, to be able to provide school fees for their kids, but a lot of social pressures and societal pressures too. As you see, those are big motivators. You see, comparing themselves where they are financially and at a status, and seeing people who are engaged in this type of crime really succeeding in their minds with having expendable income and being able to do all these other things without really thinking about the consequences. So that was another common theme, was that people are sitting in prison now thinking, God, had I known, I thought I would get a 6-month sentence, or I didn't think it would be as severe, and I'm now serving a 12-year sentence, and my kids don't know me. They're desperate to, have the school fees and all of this stuff. So that was really interesting, because not only that, but it also, they were able to tell us a lot more about just the structure of the organization, how the modus operandi of how they were recruited, or if they were recruited themselves, who they knew, how the payment flows worked. It was really comprehensive and fascinating, the type of information we were able to gather from that exercise. And just, again, just completely reinforce that the approaches that we need to take ultimately need to really address those kinds of pressures, rather than this endless war against throwing these types of poacher, lower level people in jail. It just, there will always be the temptation and unfortunately always be people that are willing to risk it to be able to provide. We did a couple follow-up reports, and we also did a similar survey in Namibia of prisoners and serving time in Namibia for the same crime types.
Yeah, and I mean, a lot of people might not realize too, in South Africa, along Kruger, like you said, population is exploding in a lot of these areas. But then on top of that, economic opportunities are just so small, and unemployment is, depending on how you look at it, post-COVID, it's between 30, maybe all the way up to 50% in some areas, which is pretty wild to imagine. So it's just almost no opportunities for a lot of these young kids that are coming into working age as well. And it's just, how are you going to support a family? So with that temptation.
Yeah, most of them were in their early 20s to 30s, male, very similar demographic, and had those pressures of, putting their kids through school. I think over 80% of them had up to a high school level or less. So, just looking at qualifications to do other skilled or semi-skilled or, labor jobs or anything else that in a similar way with parallels again with Avalon is unfortunately it's led to generations that have basically existed in an informal economy or an illicit economy and have no, even if they were to be granted amnesty, if we were to think radical and say, okay, it's do over, let's really flip this on its head, you still have a large percentage of the population who have actually no formal economic qualifications or experience. So it's a massive issue that requires a very multi-sectoral approach. And, for Avalon, we're working a lot with these to test different approaches. And the government is being really receptive, I have to say, and entertaining, these alternative models that, looking at private, public, integrated solutions that start to address some of these imbalances and really create these economic opportunities that will be not just preventative, but actually give that ownership and share in the resource. It's a long road.
Yeah. Taking a step kind of way back, I mean, as you're talking about all these different things that you're involved with, that traffic's been involved with, I mean, it sounds like you would need a city of people to do this kind of work, but maybe this is really how, you guys have this big, broad overview, and then you're able to work with these partners that have, specific skill sets. Is that kind of how this is all able to function?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, we're like perpetually overstretched. We're actually quite small organization. We've got offices scattered around the globe, but collectively, I think we're around 160 people only, which, if you divide that up against the different regions, it's a handful of people in each location. But our strength is in the systems and our ability to not just gather information, but tailor it to the needs of whoever we're working with. So we've become much more adaptive to the needs as we've broadened our engagement with different types of stakeholders. And we've been focusing almost entirely on the illicit side, but, similarly with providing legality frameworks and market opportunities for legal trade and perfectly legitimate commodities and in medicinals and timber and fisheries and all sorts of different commodity types. But I think what we do is basically it's all about partnerships. So the transport sector was one that we're so small, but the impact that we've been able to have in working with a consortium of partners has allowed us to work with an amazing array of different transport companies. And even just things like, for years we worked under that project with FIATA, which is the International Federation of Freight Forwarders Association. So as an umbrella organization for those freight forwarders and express couriers, I mean, there's 35,000 companies that fall under that umbrella.
Wow.
So even by working with them from an industry umbrella organization, we were able to revise their minimum standards to achieve a FIATA certification or diploma as a partner to do a module that includes wildlife trade issues so that at least the messaging is making it out to a wide audience. And it has to start, with these kinds of awareness options. So using those kinds of tactics and those umbrella associations was really helpful, but then actually developing content and materials that would help with the, either at the regional association level or the company level to be able to train and raise awareness about what all this means, and then creating databases that give them the ability to do their own analytics. We've launched in the last couple of years the Wildlife Trade Portal, which basically is all of the open source information we gather channeled into an open platform for anybody to run their own analytics, and being very purposeful in how open we want people to be able to access that. From a competition perspective, you could see it as a risk, but it's really important for us that we maintain that trust and neutrality, and it's all about access to information. If people have the right information, then they're able to do their jobs. If we're doing that, then we're doing something.
Yeah. I mean, we need more and more collaboration in this space to really have a chance to tackle some of these massive issues. Mm-hmm. I don't know, is there a way that, people are listening to this talk maybe in particular and thinking, wow, this is so insanely complex. How could I play any kind of role in this? But I don't know if there's any advice you would give to people that are interested in helping in some way, or just getting more involved in conservation efforts, the trade, anything that you think could be a way in.
What's amazing to me, if even just as a career professional, even just since I've started working for traffic, there's universities that offer degrees in wildlife trade. So you can actually get a degree now in a lot of different universities, which is just amazing. But, it really, even if you feel like you don't have a particular skill set in wildlife or conservation, it's such a multifaceted issue that, traffic by nature is a network of people that are with a wide range of expertise and backgrounds, from, more straight up ecologist or, conservation focused degrees, but a lot of other ones, that you wouldn't necessarily expect. And so financial crime is a good example. It was me for a while doing the work, but now we have a small army of people that are experts in financial crime working for traffic, that are based in different regions, but working with government, working with partners to really make progress at a much more focused, either regional or country level. We take a supply chain approach by nature because it's about the systems, and you can have a focus species or flagship species, but inevitably it's about the systems behind it that enable people to either identify illegality or promote the legality. So I don't know. That's not a very good answer, but
no, there's just so many different ways you can get involved, and even
I think, well, for one, it's still a really under-resourced issue. As much as we are making really big progress and seeing this at the level that it needs to be internationally. And if you look at the resources that are available to tackle it or combat it, especially when you're dealing with the tens of billions of dollars annually that are being generated from the illicit side, being countered with significantly smaller budget globally, you have to be really selective in the types of trades or commodities that you think will, make progress, but also maybe tackle some other issues at the same time. Mm-hmm. That's something that we have to deal with all the time. There's too much for us to grapple with. So how do we prioritize our time?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, if you have the space to volunteer or intern, there's probably thousands and thousands of organizations that would take you in a heartbeat because of that.
Yeah. Easy. Yeah, including ours. We often work with interns that do great work and help us a lot. Yeah.
Yeah. So why do you keep doing this? I feel like you talked a bit at the beginning about, your curiosity that drives you, but why do you keep waking up every day, tackling these huge problems that seem insurmountable to some? What drives you?
I enjoy those little nuggets of success that, I kind of equated to when I was a young kid going door to door fundraising for, I don't know, an environmental organization at the time. And you have all the best intentions and, every door representing a real world reality. And 99% of the time they say, yeah, thanks a lot, kid. Good luck to you, and shut the door in your face. But there is one door that you get a donation and you get $20 to go into the and I guess it's a similar kind of feeling, is that for every doom and gloom scenario or issue that we have to deal with, there's equal amounts of positive things that are happening that counteract and as a network, I just motivated by the people that are working tirelessly on this issues and really, really trying to make a difference, and whether or not that translates to changes in statistics on the ground. And, some of these things are so long term that to even be able to see a tangible impact takes years for the effort and sometimes longer. And, we all wish that we saw that the trends and the stats going in the opposite direction for for a lot of these species. But look at rhinos. Let's bring it back to rhinos. They've gone through. They've really taken a hit, but the horizon is looking better than it was a couple of years ago. And of course, we had this anomaly with COVID, and that definitely impacted just the amount of illegal trade happening. But I think we've learned so much from what it takes from either a national level to put in the strategies in place to look at this from a really multifaceted level, that we're starting to see the rewards of that. And we knew it would take a while, but it's just nice to see, even from the demand side, all the stats are going in the right direction. So that's a motivator for sure.
Yeah, I mean, we've got to focus on the hope and the fact that we do have impact with our actions and that we can make a difference. Maybe we can't save everything all the time, but long term, we can actually really change and steer the direction of where we're heading.
Exactly.
Yeah, this has been a really great conversation. I feel like we could probably go on for another hour, but
Yeah.
I don't want to I don't want to hold you up too much longer. So yeah, I really want to thank you for taking the time, walking us through what traffic is doing, some of your story, and some of these difficult topics, just to get a better understanding of how things are working under the hood. I think it's been super valuable.
Pleasure. No, I really appreciate even the platform, because as you said, these issues are really complex. So to actually have the time to talk through things and really show all the different angles and perspectives is important. It's because a lot of the stuff you see in the media or even just are exposed to, you only get a certain layer of it, where just being able to have the opportunity to dig deeper and discuss is always a good thing. So I really appreciate it.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, you can't get this stuff across in a 2-minute news broadcast.
Yeah, unfortunately.
Yeah.
At least when you waffle on like I do too. So.
Awesome. Well, thanks so much, Nick. Hopefully we'll have another conversation again sometime in the future.
Yeah, I hope so. Thanks so much.
Awesome. Thank you for listening to the Rhino Man podcast. If you enjoyed this episode and you're excited to see the film succeed, please subscribe and review our podcast on Spotify and iTunes. Then follow us on Instagram and Facebook at Rhino Man the Movie. More details about Rhino Man, the social impact campaign, and future screenings are at rhinomanthemovie.org. To learn more about the Global Conservation Corps and their work, visit globalconservationcorps.org. Sign up for the newsletter and follow GCC on all of the social platforms. If you like this podcast, make sure to subscribe and catch up on GCC's Voices of Nature podcast, where Bob Ludke interviews a wide range of people who've dedicated their lives to making a difference in conservation. A special thanks goes out to Simone Wilson for the music for this podcast. He's the brilliant composer for Rhino Man the Movie. Learn more about his work at simonewilsonmusic.com. Until next time, I'm John Jerko, and this is the Rhino Man Podcast.